Can a statement be true and false at the exact same time? Can you truly have free will if every future event is already set in stone? What happens when logic itself seems to break down, trapping even the smartest minds in an endless loop of contradictions? In the medieval world from the 11th to the 15th century, brilliant scholars wrestled with these brain-bending questions, challenging the very foundations of reason. Number 10. The liar paradox. When truth becomes a lie that is still a lie. Step into a university lecture hall in Paris or Oxford in the 14th century, and you might have heard hushed, urgent discussions about something that seemed so simple, yet tore apart the very fabric of logical thought. This was the famous, or perhaps infamous, liar paradox, known to medieval logicians as one of the insolubles or insolubilia. Core idea is deceptively straightforward. This statement is false. Take a moment to truly grasp. If the statement, "this statement is false," is true, then what it says must be correct, meaning it is false. But if it is false, then what it says is incorrect, which means it must be true. We are trapped. It cannot be true without being false, and it cannot be false without being true. This simple sentence becomes an unyielding logical knot, twisting reason into a circle with no exit. For the sharpest minds of the medieval period, this was not just a clever word game. It was a serious threat to their understanding of truth, language, and even God. If a statement could be both true and false at the same time, or neither, then what did truth even mean? How could they build a solid foundation for philosophy, theology, or law if language itself could betray them in such a fundamental way? The stakes were incredibly high. Scholars like William of Ockham, famous for his Occam's razor principle, dedicated significant portions of their logical works to grappling with the liar paradox. He recognized the profound difficulties it presented. Occam and others, including Jean Buridan, a celebrated logician and philosopher from the University of Paris in the 14th century, explored various ways to disarm this logical bomb. Some argued that such a statement simply could not be meaningfully uttered, that it was a flawed construction from the start. Others tried to categorize statements, perhaps suggesting that a statement cannot refer to its own truth value. Buridan, for instance, proposed that no statement could declare its own falsity. If a statement P asserts P is false, then it simply fails to be a proper statement at all. Or perhaps it asserts something that makes its own assertion impossible. He saw the liar as a special case of a sophism, a deceptive argument that appears logical but hides a fundamental error. However, even with these sophisticated analyses, the paradox continued to confound. Every proposed solution seemed to lead to new difficulties, or merely shifted the problem around. Consider a simpler, everyday example, though still potent. Imagine a town where the only barber shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. Now ask, does the barber shave himself? If he shaves himself, then he is one of those who shaves himself. But he only shaves those who do not shave themselves, so he cannot shave himself. If he does not shave himself, then he is one of those who do not shave themselves, and the barber shaves all such men, meaning he must shave himself. The paradox persists, mirroring the structure of the liar. While the barber paradox is often attributed to Bertrand Russell in a later era, its underlying logic of self-reference and contradiction was very much alive in medieval discussions of the liar. The inability to definitively resolve the liar paradox haunted medieval logicians. It showed them that even the most carefully constructed logical systems could be vulnerable to seemingly trivial sentences. Pursuit of a definitive answer led to an explosion of new logical theories and an incredible sharpening of analytical tools. They delved into the nature of propositions, terms, and the very act of signifying meaning. Yet, The liar remained a persistent thorn in the side of medieval rationality, a constant reminder that the world of logic held depths they had yet to fully chart. It stood as a symbol of the mind's endless quest to understand the boundaries of what can be truly known and spoken. Number 9. The Sorites Paradox. When is a heap not a heap? Picture this. You have a large pile of sand. It is undeniably a heap. Now, what if you remove one single grain of sand? Is it still a heap? Most people would agree that it is. What if you remove another? You continue this process, removing one grain of sand at a time. At what point does it stop being a heap? Can one single grain of sand, removed from a large collection, be the precise action that transforms a heap into a non-heap? This is the core of the Sorites Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, a question that perplexed thinkers for centuries, including those in the medieval era. The word Sorites comes from the Greek word soros, meaning heap. This paradox highlights the fundamental problem of vagueness in language and in the world around us. Medieval logicians, much like their ancient predecessors, were deeply interested in how language related to reality, how precise our definitions could and should be. They sought to create clear, unambiguous categories for everything from moral virtues to physical objects. The Sorites Paradox shattered that neat categorical world. If you accept the premise that removing a single grain from a heap still leaves a heap, and you repeat this process enough times, you are logically forced to conclude that even a single grain of sand is a heap. But this is absurd. A single grain of sand is clearly not a heap, so where did we go wrong? The problem lies in the inability to identify a precise boundary. There is no magical grain of sand that, when removed, suddenly makes the difference between a heap and a non-heap. Medieval scholars, such as Peter Abelard in the 12th century, grappling with issues of definition and distinction, would have encountered the conceptual challenges posed by vagueness. While not always explicitly named Sorites in their writings, the underlying problem of defining boundaries for terms like bald, tall, or rich was very much present in their discussions on language and categorization. They were constructing elaborate logical systems, and the inability to draw clear lines presented a significant obstacle. Consider a person with a full head of hair. If we remove one hair, they are still not bald. Remove another and another. At what point do they become bald? Is there a specific number of hairs that marks the exact transition from not bald to bald? Just like the heap, it seems impossible to pinpoint. This lack of a clear threshold challenged the precision that medieval logic strived for. Their logical tools, often based on clear syllogisms and definitions, struggled to accommodate the fuzzy realities of the world. Some medieval approaches might have involved distinguishing between different senses of heap, perhaps a heap in common parlance versus a logically defined heap. Others might have explored the idea of degrees of a property, suggesting that properties like heapness are not absolute, but exist on a spectrum. However, these were often conceptual struggles rather than definitive solutions. Problem remained that language seemed to fail them when trying to describe gradual transitions. The Sorites Paradox forced medieval thinkers to confront the limitations of human language and categorization when dealing with continuous phenomena. It showed them that while logic could be precise, the world it described was often stubbornly imprecise. This paradox contributed to the ongoing debate about universals and particulars, about how abstract concepts relate to concrete, messy reality. The inability to give a clear, logical answer to when does a heap stop being a heap served as a humbling reminder that even the most rigorous logical frameworks could be tripped up by the seemingly simple. It was a problem that continued to baffle, leaving scholars with the unsettling realization that some truths might not fit neatly into their well-ordered logical boxes. Number 8. The Omnipotence Paradox. Can God create an unliftable stone? This was perhaps one of the most explosive paradoxes for the medieval mind, reaching far beyond the confines of pure logic and striking at the heart of theology and faith. The question was simple, yet devastating in its implications. Can an omnipotent being, specifically God, create a stone so heavy that even he cannot lift it? At first glance, it might seem like a mere brain teaser. But for medieval scholars, whose entire worldview was built upon the absolute omnipotence of God, this was a profound challenge. If God can create such a stone, then there is something he cannot do, lift the stone, which contradicts his omnipotence. But if he cannot create such a stone, then there is still something he cannot do, create the stone, which also contradicts his omnipotence. Either way, his omnipotence seems to be compromised. This paradox was not just a philosophical puzzle, it was a theological crisis. The concept of God's absolute power was a cornerstone of Christian doctrine. If logic itself could demonstrate a limitation to this power, then the very foundations of their faith seemed to tremble. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham, all towering figures of medieval thought, grappled with this issue. Their discussions revolved around the nature of omnipotence and the limits of logic when applied to divine attributes. Aquinas, for instance, argued that God's omnipotence extends only to what is logically possible. God cannot make a square circle, not because his power is limited, but because a square circle is a contradiction in terms, an impossibility in itself. Therefore, if creating a stone that he cannot lift is a logical contradiction, since it implies a limitation on his power, then it is not something omnipotence can achieve. It is not a lack of power, but a lack of coherent possibility. In this view, God's power is limitless within the realm of the logically coherent, and the paradox simply presents a non-existent thing. However, this solution was not universally accepted, and the debate raged. Some argued that limiting God's power, even to what is logically possible, was still a limitation. What if God's power transcended human logic? This led to discussions about absolute power, potestas absoluta, versus ordained power, potestas ornata, a distinction used by some medieval thinkers, especially Occam. Absolute power meant God could do anything that did not imply a contradiction. Ordained power referred to the way God actually chose to order the world. But even with these nuanced distinctions, the core tension remained. Paradox forced thinkers to confront the very definition of omnipotence. Does it mean being able to do anything whatsoever, even contradictory things? Or does it mean being able to do everything that is logically coherent? The latter interpretation was often favored, but it still left many feeling uneasy. It felt like human reason was placing boundaries on the infinite power of God. The stakes were immense. If God's power was truly absolute in every conceivable way, even contradictory ways, then human reason seemed useless in understanding him. If his power was limited by logic, then was he truly all-powerful in the most profound sense? Question remained a profound source of intellectual and theological discomfort, challenging the very bedrock of medieval cosmology and faith. The unmovable stone remained a heavy burden on the minds of the brightest medieval scholars, a paradox that revealed the deep complexities at the intersection of philosophy and theology. Number 7. Buridan's ass. The donkey caught between two choices. Picture a donkey, perfectly rational and perfectly hungry. It stands exactly equidistant between two identical, equally appealing piles of hay. There is no difference between the piles. No stack is bigger, no strand looks tastier. Which pile should the donkey choose? This is the famous thought experiment known as Buridan's ass, often attributed to the 14th century French philosopher Jean Buridan. Though the core idea of a balanced choice existed before him, the problem seems trivial at first. But for medieval logicians and philosophers, it was a profound challenge to their understanding of rationality, free will, and the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything that happens has a reason, a cause, or a justification. If the donkey is perfectly rational, and the choices are perfectly identical, there is no sufficient reason to choose one pile over the other. If the donkey is perfectly rational, it should weigh the options and choose the better one. But when both options are equally good, what then? If it has no reason to prefer one, it should not move. If it has no reason not to move, it should move. It is stuck in an endless logical loop. According to the paradox, the donkey, unable to make a rational choice, would simply starve to death, frozen by its own perfect rationality. This paradox was a serious intellectual problem. Medieval philosophy, heavily influenced by Aristotle, believed in a universe governed by order and reason. Everything had a cause, a purpose. The idea that a perfectly rational being could be paralyzed by an absence of distinguishing features between choices was deeply unsettling. It challenged the very notion of how decisions are made. For thinkers like Baffled, the paradox raised critical questions about human free will. If humans are rational beings, and our choices are always based on reasons, what happens when reasons are perfectly balanced? Does it mean we are not truly free, but merely determined by the strongest motive? Or does it mean there is a component of freedom that allows us to choose even without a sufficient reason, that is external to our will? Baffled himself, while the paradox is named after him, likely argued against the conclusion that the ass would starve. He believed that in such situations, the will would act, not out of a stronger external reason, but out of its own inherent freedom to choose. Even if there is no difference between the options, the will can simply decide to pick one. This choice itself creates the sufficient reason. So, for Baffled, the ass would not starve, but would simply pick a pile, demonstrating its freedom. However, the paradox continued to be discussed and debated. It highlighted the difficulties of reconciling strict determinism, where every event, including choice, is caused, with the intuitive reality of free will. It also forced medieval logicians to think deeply about the nature of preference and utility. Could there ever be truly identical options? Or would some subtle, perhaps even unconscious factor always tip the scales? The lasting impact of Baffled's ass was its powerful illustration of a logical impasse in decision-making when faced with perfectly balanced alternatives. It revealed a potential blind spot in purely rational models of behavior and pushed medieval thinkers to explore the messy complexities of human and animal choice, a struggle that continued to baffle minds trying to reconcile reason with the apparent freedom of action. A starving ass became a haunting image of logic's limits when confronted with the seemingly simple act of choosing. Number 6. The Crocodile Paradox. The devious deal with a tricky reptile. Prepare for a tale that sounds like it belongs in a fable but became a serious logical headache for medieval minds. The Crocodile Paradox. Picture a mother whose child has been snatched by a cunning crocodile. The crocodile, surprisingly articulate, makes an offer. "I will return your child if you correctly predict whether I will return him. If you predict incorrectly, I will keep him." What should the mother say? This seemingly straightforward predicament quickly unravels into a terrifying logical trap. Let us explore the mother's options. Scenario 1. The mother predicts, "You will return my child." If the crocodile does return the child, then the mother's prediction was correct. According to the crocodile's promise, he must return the child because the prediction was correct. This seems consistent. But what if the crocodile does not return the child? Then the mother's prediction was incorrect. According to the crocodile's promise, he should keep the child because the prediction was incorrect. But if he keeps the child, it means the mother's prediction, "You will return my child," was indeed incorrect. So the crocodile's action, keeping the child, is consistent with the condition for keeping the child. This also seems consistent. So if the mother says, "You will return my child," the crocodile can choose either to return or keep the child, and in both cases he would be acting consistently with his promise. This does not help the mother get her child back. Scenario 2. The mother predicts, "You will not return my child." This is where the paradox truly bites. If the crocodile does return the child, then the mother's prediction, meaning "You will not return my child," was incorrect. According to the crocodile's promise, he should keep the child because the prediction was incorrect, but this contradicts his action of returning the child. He cannot both return the child and keep it. A logical impossibility arises. If the crocodile does not return the child, then the mother's prediction, "You will not return my child," was correct. According to the crocodile's promise, he must return the child because the prediction was correct. But this contradicts his action of not returning the child. He cannot both keep the child and return it. Another logical impossibility. In the second scenario, no matter what the crocodile does, he is forced into a contradiction. This is the heart of the paradox. The mother's second prediction makes it impossible for the crocodile to keep his word without contradicting himself. This kind of problem, involving conditional statements and tricky self-referential loops, was deeply fascinating and frustrating to medieval logicians. While the crocodile paradox has ancient roots, medieval scholars, particularly those interested in law contracts and the precise meaning of conditional statements, would have found it incredibly relevant. They often analyzed sophisms' clever but misleading arguments, and the crocodile paradox is a prime example of a sophism that exposes the limits of clear logical analysis when dealing with certain types of conditional promises. Think of it in terms of legal agreements. If a contract could lead to a situation where fulfilling its terms becomes logically impossible, how could justice be served? How could agreements be reliably made? Medieval jurisprudence, like medieval logic, sought clarity and avoidance of contradiction. Crocodile paradox showed how easily those foundations could crumble. Scholars would dissect the language, examining the precise phrasing of the crocodile's promise. Was the promise inherently flawed? Was there a hidden assumption? Some might argue that the crocodile's initial premise is ill-formed, or that the question itself is unanswerable in a way that allows the promise to be fulfilled. Problem highlights the potential for language to create unresolvable dilemmas, even when spoken by a surprisingly philosophical reptile. Crocodile paradox remained an unresolved quandary, a stark reminder that even well-defined rules, when combined with self-reference or tricky conditions, could lead to a logical deadlock. Challenged medieval thinkers to be incredibly precise in their definitions and to always be wary of seemingly simple statements that could hide profound contradictions, leaving the mother and the scholars alike scratching their heads. Number 5. The paradox of future contingents. Is tomorrow's sea battle already true? Imagine a vast ocean, and tomorrow a great sea battle is scheduled to take place. Either it will happen, or it will not happen. For medieval thinkers influenced heavily by ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, this seemingly simple observation led to one of the most profound and unsettling paradoxes, the paradox of future contingents. The core question was this: if a statement about a future event, for example, "There will be a sea battle tomorrow," is either true or false now, does that mean the future is already determined? And if so, does it mean we have no free will? This was not a mere academic exercise. It struck at the heart of medieval theology and philosophy, touching upon divine foreknowledge, human freedom, and the nature of time itself. If God already knows everything that will happen, down to the smallest detail, then how can human beings truly be free to make choices? If there will be a sea battle tomorrow is already true right now, then tomorrow's sea battle must happen. There is no escape from it. But if it must happen, how can the sailors be said to choose to fight, or to be free to stay home? Aristotle himself grappled with this. He suggested that statements about future contingent events, events that might or might not happen, are neither true nor false until the event actually occurs. Before the sea battle, the statement, "There will be a sea battle," is not strictly true or false. Becomes true or false only when the battle either happens or does not happen. This indeterminacy was his attempt to preserve free will. However, medieval logicians, especially those deeply rooted in Christian theology, found this difficult to accept. For them, God was omniscient. He knew everything, past, present, and future. If God knows that the sea battle will happen, then it must be true that the sea battle will happen. And if it's true, then it's necessary. Necessity, it seemed, crushed freedom. Thinkers like William of Ockham dedicated immense intellectual energy to this problem. Ockham and others explored various ways to reconcile divine foreknowledge with human free will. One popular approach was to distinguish between different types of necessity. They argued that just because something is known to be true by God does not mean it is logically necessary in the same way that all bachelors are unmarried is necessary. God's knowledge, they argued, does not cause the event. It merely reflects it. Yet, this explanation still left many uneasy. If the statement, "the sea battle will happen," is true now, then it was true yesterday and the day before that. It always was true. How then can the future be genuinely open? Problem was often framed as, if it is true that P will happen, then P must happen. If P must happen, then it cannot not happen. If P cannot not happen, then we are not free to prevent P. The implications for moral responsibility were also profound. If all our actions are determined by an already true future, then how can we be held accountable for our sins or praised for our virtues? If we are not truly free, then concepts like reward, punishment, and even prayer seemed to lose their meaning. This was a direct assault on the moral framework of medieval Christian society. No single universally accepted solution emerged from the medieval debates. Scholars wrestled with it, proposing subtle distinctions and elaborate logical arguments, but the tension between an all-knowing God and truly free human beings remained a persistent, baffling paradox. It forced medieval thinkers to stretch the boundaries of their logical systems and to deeply reconsider the nature of time, truth, and the divine, leaving them with an unresolved tension that shaped centuries of philosophical and theological thought. Number 4. The Master and Pupil Paradox. When learning becomes a legal trap. Imagine a clever, ambitious young man eager to become a lawyer. He finds a renowned master of rhetoric and law, Protagoras, who agrees to teach him. They strike a unique deal. The pupil, Euothus, will pay his master for his lessons only after he wins his first case in court. If he never wins a case, he never has to pay. This sounds like a great deal for the pupil, a risk-free education. But this arrangement leads to a spectacular logical deadlock, a problem that medieval logicians, especially those interested in contracts and legal reasoning, would have found utterly captivating. The lessons conclude and Euothus, for some reason, never takes a case. Protagoras naturally becomes impatient for his payment, so Protagoras decides to sue Euothus for the money. And this is where the paradox truly begins to unravel. Consider the arguments from both sides, as medieval scholars would have meticulously dissected them. Protagoras' argument. If I win this case against Euothus, Protagoras might argue, then by the court's judgment, Euothus must pay me. Since this is his first case, and I win, he will have won his first case, which means, according to our original contract, he must pay me, so in any scenario where I win, I get paid. Euothus' argument. If Protagoras wins this case against me, Euothus would counter, then I will have lost my first case. According to our contract, I only have to pay him if I win my first case. Since I will have lost, I am not obligated to pay him. So, if he wins, I don't pay. On the other hand, Euthyphus might continue. If I win this case against Protagoras, then by the court's judgment I do not have to pay him, and since this is my first case and I win, I am then obligated by the contract to pay him. But if I win, I don't have to pay. This is where it gets tricky. Let us simplify and focus on the immediate outcome of the lawsuit. If the court rules in favor of Protagoras, meaning Euthyphus must pay, from the court's perspective, Euthyphus must pay. From the contract's perspective, Euthyphus's side, Euthyphus lost his first case, so he does not have to pay contradiction. Court says he must pay, but the contract, based on the outcome, says he does not. If the court rules in favor of Euthyphus, meaning he does not have to pay. From the court's perspective, Euthyphus does not have to pay. From the contract's perspective, Euthyphus's side, Euthyphus won his first case. According to the contract, winning his first case means he must pay Protagoras contradiction. Court says he does not have to pay, but the contract, based on the outcome, says he must. No matter which way the court rules, the outcome seems to lead to a logical paradox, making it impossible to uphold both the court's decision and the original contract simultaneously. Problem lies in the contract's condition being tied to the very first legal outcome, which is precisely the case that is being litigated. Medieval logicians, especially those concerned with casus or specific legal cases and their logical implications, would have found this paradox incredibly challenging. It showed them that even seemingly reasonable agreements, when structured in a self-referential or outcome-dependent way, could lead to irresolvable dilemmas. They would have explored the nature of conditions precedent and conditions subsequent in contracts, trying to identify precisely where the logical flaw lay. Some might argue that the contract itself was ill-formed from the start, a sophism that should be dismissed as logically invalid. Others might suggest that the court should focus only on the immediate legal obligation, regardless of the contract's longer-term implications. However, the core dilemma, that fulfilling the contract's terms based on the first outcome leads to a logical loop, remained a source of intellectual fascination and frustration. It served as a stark reminder of the complexities inherent in legal language and the ever-present danger of logical traps even in seemingly clear agreements. The master and pupil paradox continued to baffle, leaving both master and pupil in an endless cycle of payment disputes. Number 3. The Epimenides Paradox, the liar from Crete. This paradox is a classic, a variant of the famous liar paradox, but with a specific geographical twist that made it particularly intriguing for medieval scholars. It goes like this. Epimenides, a philosopher and prophet from Crete, famously said, "All Cretans are liars." Now, let us unpack this statement and see why it baffled so many brilliant minds, from ancient Greeks to medieval logicians. If Epimenides, being a Cretan himself, says all Cretans are liars, what happens? Scenario 1. Assume Epimenides is telling the truth. If all Cretans are liars is a true statement, then every single Cretan, including Epimenides himself, must be a liar. But if Epimenides is a liar, then his statement, "all Cretans are liars," must be false. This creates a direct contradiction. If his statement is true, it must be false. Scenario 2. Assume Epimenides is lying. If all Cretans are liars is a false statement, then it is not true that all Cretans are liars. This means there must be at least one Cretan who is not a liar. This Cretan could be Epimenides himself. If Epimenides is not a liar, then his statement, "all Cretans are liars," is indeed false, which is consistent with our initial assumption that he is lying. This scenario seems to avoid a contradiction. However, the full force of the paradox comes when considering the truth value of the statement itself, not just the speaker's general tendency. Problem truly emerges when the statement is interpreted strictly. If all Cretans are liars means that every single statement made by a Cretan is false. If Epimenides is a Cretan and he says all Cretans are liars, then the very statement he makes must be false. But if it is false that all Cretans are liars, then it means that at least some Cretans tell the truth. It could be that Epimenides is one of those truth-telling Cretans. But then his statement, "all Cretans are liars," must be false, which means he is telling the truth by saying something false. Epimenides' paradox, often discussed in conjunction with the pure liar, highlighted the dangers of self-reference and universal claims. Medieval logicians were meticulous about defining terms and ensuring clarity. They used concepts like supposition theory, how terms refer to things in different contexts, to try and untangle logical knots. They might have argued that liar in "all Cretans are liars" implies a general disposition to lie, not that every single statement is false. Or they might have argued that the statement "all Cretans are liars" cannot apply to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. This paradox, with its ancient roots, was widely known and discussed in medieval schools. Figures like Walter Burleigh, a prominent English scholastic philosopher and logician from the 14th century, engaged with such insolubles. They explored whether the paradox arose from an ill-formed proposition, an ambiguity in language, or a deeper flaw in their logical systems. The Epimenides paradox served as a constant reminder that even seemingly simple sentences could hide profound logical traps. It contributed to the extensive medieval discourse on the nature of truth, the properties of propositions, and the limits of language. No single, universally accepted solution emerged, and the puzzle continued to baffle, underscoring the enduring challenge of self-referential statements for even the sharpest minds trying to make sense of the world through rigorous logic. It was a clear demonstration that sometimes truth and falsity could dance in a way that spun reason into an impossible loop. Number 2. The Horns Paradox, a twisted trick of logic. Prepare for a sophism that sounds utterly absurd, yet was carefully dissected by medieval logicians, who were experts at identifying hidden tricks in arguments. This is the Horns Paradox, also known as Cornutus, a piece of ancient trickery that medieval thinkers took seriously as a demonstration of how language can mislead. The argument goes like this: what you have not lost, you still have. You have not lost horns. This conclusion, that a person listening to this argument suddenly possesses horns, is clearly ridiculous. Yet, the argument appears to follow a valid logical structure. It looks like a syllogism. Premise 1, all A are B. Premise 2, C is a conclusion, therefore C is B. Let us break down why this baffled people, and how medieval logicians would have approached such a seemingly nonsensical but structurally persuasive argument. The problem lies not in the logical form, but in the deceptive use of language, specifically the word lost. Medieval logicians, from figures like Peter Abelard in the 12th century to the sophisticated logicians of the 14th century, like John Wycliffe, were keenly aware of fallacies or errors in reasoning. The Horns Paradox is a classic example of a fallacy of ambiguity, particularly what is known as equivocation or amphipoly. Let us look at the first premise. What you have not lost, you still have. This premise is generally true. If you have not lost your wallet, you still have your wallet. If you have not lost your memory, you still have your memory. The phrase, What you have not lost usually refers to something you possessed. In the first place, now consider the second premise. You have not lost horns. This premise is also true for most people, because they never had horns to begin with. You cannot lose something you never possessed. The logical trick occurs when these two seemingly true premises are combined to reach the absurd conclusion. The error lies in the implicit assumption that the horns in the second premise refers to something that could have been possessed and then lost, just like the what in the first premise implies. The first premise implies a prior possession. The second premise speaks of something that was never possessed. Medieval logicians would meticulously analyze the supposition of the terms. Supposition was their theory of how terms refer to things in different contexts. They would argue that horns in the second premise does not suppose, refer to, something that was ever actually possessed. The argument plays on our intuitive understanding of not lost to imply still possess, even when the thing in question was never possessed at all. This kind of logical analysis was crucial in medieval education. Students were trained to identify such fallacies, whether in theological debates, legal arguments, or philosophical discussions. The ability to spot a deceptive argument even when it looked logically sound on the surface was a hallmark of a well-trained medieval mind. They had names for these fallacies: fallacia equivocations, fallacy of equivocation, fallacia compositionis et divisionis, fallacy of composition and division, and so on. The horns paradox served as a vivid example of how important precision in language was. It showed that even if the premises seemed individually true and the structure appeared valid, a subtle shift in the meaning or reference of a term could lead to a completely illogical conclusion. It was a playful, yet powerful demonstration of the hidden dangers in everyday language, and a constant reminder for medieval scholars to scrutinize every word and every assumption in an argument, leaving them with the strange notion that a well-crafted sentence could make you grow horns. Number 1. The paradox of the grain of millet. How silence can lead to sound. Prepare for a paradox that challenges our understanding of perception, composition, and the very nature of sound. This is the paradox of the grain of millet, often attributed to the ancient philosopher Zeno of Elea, but deeply pondered and debated by medieval thinkers as they grappled with atomism, continuous quantities, and the relationship between parts and wholes. The paradox in its simplest form goes like this. If a single grain of millet, when it falls, makes no sound, how can a heap of 10,000 grains of millet make a sound when they fall? Let us break down the perplexing nature of this paradox for medieval minds. The premises seem undeniable. A single grain of millet is so small and light that its fall produces no perceptible sound. We can all agree on that. Now, if we take 10,000 such grains and drop them, they most certainly make a distinct sound, a rustle, or a patter. Paradox arises from the following line of reasoning, which seems logically inescapable. A single grain of millet falling makes no sound. If something makes no sound, then adding another thing that makes no sound will still result in no sound. Principle of additive effect for zero sounds. Therefore, 2 grains make no sound. 3 grains make no sound. And by continuing this reasoning, 10,000 grains of millet should also make no sound. But this conclusion directly contradicts our experience. We hear the sound of 10,000 grains. So where is the mistake? If each individual part contributes nothing to the sound, how can the whole produce a sound? From where does the sound emerge? Medieval logicians and natural philosophers, including those interested in physics and sensation, would have found this paradox deeply unsettling. They were concerned with the composition of matter, the nature of perception, and whether qualities like sound were inherent to individual parts or emerge only at a certain threshold of combination. Some medieval approaches might have focused on the limitations of human perception. Perhaps a single grain does produce a tiny, imperceptible sound, a sound too faint for human ears, but which exists nonetheless. When enough of these imperceptible sounds combine, they cross the threshold of audibility. This introduces the idea that our senses are not infinitely precise, and that there are realities beyond what we can directly perceive. Others might have argued that the paradox highlights a flaw in the assumption that qualities are simply additive in a linear fashion. The sound of a heap might not be the sum of individual no sounds, but an emergent property of the collective action of many grains interacting with each other or the surface they fall upon. This touched on the philosophical debate about emergent properties. Properties that arise in a system but are not present in its individual components. Consider the analogy of warmth. One molecule might not be warm in the human sense, but a vast collection of molecules vibrating together creates the sensation of heat. Is sound similar? Paradox of the grain of millet forced medieval thinkers to consider the very nature of sensation and the relationship between micro and macro phenomena. It questioned whether a quantitative increase could lead to a qualitative change. It pushed them to think beyond simple linear logic and to explore the complexities of how qualities come into being. Ultimately, like many of Zeno's paradoxes, a full resolution often requires concepts not available to medieval thinkers, such as advanced physics or the precise understanding of sound waves and thresholds of perception. However, the paradox served its purpose. It baffled the brightest minds, forcing them to refine their understanding of logic, perception, and the properties of the physical world. It demonstrated that even the most seemingly obvious observations could hide deep, baffling logical pitfalls, leaving scholars to wonder how 1,000 silences could suddenly create a noise.